Welcome and thank you for waiting. All participants are currently on a listen-only mode for the duration of today's webinar. We will have a Q&A feature active in WebEx. You can access that at the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx window. You can send questions there anytime, and we'll try our best to answer as many as we can at the designated time. Today's webinar is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the session over to your host, Eric Jensen from the U.S. Census Bureau. Eric, you may begin.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Eric Jensen. I'm Senior Research Scientist for Population Estimates and Coverage Measurement. I'm joined by my colleagues Luke Rogers and Christine Hartley, who will help me later during the Q&A portion of our webinar. As Anthony mentioned, if you have questions during the presentation, you can put those in the chat and we'll answer those at the end during the Q&A portion. The Population Estimates Program disseminates official measures of population and housing units between the decennial censuses. And these are mandated as part of Title 13, U.S. Code Section 181. The population estimates are used to allocate trillions of dollars of funding. They're also used as population controls for demographic surveys and denominators for vital rates. They're used for academic and business research, also program planning in the public and private sectors. Each year we produce a time series that has data that goes from the last census up through the current vintage year, and that represents the latest year of estimates that are available. Currently, the latest year of estimates that you can get on our website are the vintage 2023 population estimates, but later this week we'll be releasing the vintage 24 population estimates. And those estimates will contain a time series from April 1st, 2020 to July 1st, 2024. We produce population estimates for 80,000 or more geographic areas, and this is 40,000 or more communities. So we produce estimates for the nation, for regions and divisions, for the states, for counties, also for metropolitan and micropolitan statistical agencies. And then below the county level, we produce estimates for cities and towns. We also produce estimates for the Puerto Rico Commonwealth and Puerto Rico municipios, which are the equivalent to a county. This table shows the different type of estimates that we produce by the various geographic levels. So for total resident population, we produce this each year for all levels of geography. So for the nation, states, metro micro statistical areas, counties, cities and towns, Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico municipios. The components of population change, so births, deaths, net migration. We produce these for all levels of geography except for cities and towns and the Puerto Rico municipios. The population characteristics, so age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, we produce these by all geographic levels except for cities and towns, which only get total population. And note that for Puerto Rico, both the Commonwealth and municipios, we do this by age and sex, and we don't do it by race or Hispanic origin. At the national level, we produce 5 population universes. So this is like the resident population, the household population, the group quarters population. We produce group quarters estimates by characteristics at the national level, and then by totals for the state and counties. And then we produce housing unit estimates for the nation, states, and counties. We release our estimates on a flow basis throughout the year. As I mentioned before, we're going to be releasing later this week the population totals, components of change, and voting age population. This is for the nation, states, and Puerto Rico Commonwealth. In March of 2025, we'll release the population totals and components of change for the metro and micropolitan statistical areas, counties, and Puerto Rico municipios. April is our population by age and sex release. This is the national level. In May, we'll have our population totals for cities and towns, so our sub-county release, and also housing units for the nation, states, and counties. And then in June, we'll have our population characteristics release. So population by age, sex, race, and Hispanic origin. and that's for the nation states, metro and micro areas, and counties. And then also in that release, we'll have our population by age and sex for Puerto Rico and for the municipios. And one thing to note is these dates are subject to change, but this is generally the pattern that we have. So how do you access the population estimates? So the main way people access the estimates is on our web page. And to find that, you go to census.gov. You then click on surveys and programs. And then under that, you'll find population estimates. Once you've gotten to our web page, there's a tab for data, and you should be able to find everything that you need there. You can also find our estimates on the QuickFacts data tool, which is also on the census homepage. And then increasingly, people are using the application programming interface, or API, as a way to get our estimates. The estimates for the nation, states, and counties are produced using a cohort component method. So for this method, we start with the estimates base, we add births, we subtract deaths, and we add net migration. And this gets us our population estimate. So the starting point for each vintage of the population is our base. And over recent decades, the decennial census typically provided all the information that we needed for the base population. And I'll talk in a moment about some changes that we've made this decade. For births and deaths, we get data from the National Center for Health Statistics. These data come from birth and death certificates. They then get processed by states, which later get processed by the National Center for Health Statistics. For net migration, for domestic migration, we use administrative records. And then for international migration, we use mostly survey data from the American Community Survey. So this gets us to our population estimate. For housing unit estimates, we also use a components of change method. Here we use a housing unit base. And for the current decade, the housing unit base is coming all from the 2020 census. In the 2020 census, those housing units didn't have noise or differential privacy added noise, and so they're invariant. We then add to that the new construction and new mobile homes, and then we subtract the housing unit loss, and this gets us our housing unit estimate. For our sub-county population estimates, we use what's called the distributive housing unit method. So the first thing we have to calculate is the initial household population estimate. So to do this, we take the number of housing units and we multiply that by the average persons per household. We then, to get the resident population for that area, we take that initial household population estimate, we multiply that by a county household rate factor. We do this so that our sub-county estimates are consistent with our county estimates. And then we add the group borders population. There's 3 updates or changes that we can have to the estimates with each vintage. The first are base population updates. These can happen because of legal boundary changes and other geographic updates. Outcomes from official census programs, for example, the count question resolution, and also changes to our estimates, our methods for estimating the base. There's also revisions to the individual components of change. And so again, that's births, deaths, domestic migration, international migration. And so as we're incorporating either more recent or more complete data, input data, we can also have changes to the methods for each of those specific components. So that's another way our estimates can change. And then finally, there can be changes to the cohort component process that we use to create the estimates from those different inputs, those components. As I mentioned earlier, in past decades, we've used the decennial census data practically as the base for our population estimates. But with this decade, because of some of the limitations of when data files became available and other things, we've used what's called the blended base approach. So we started this for the vintage 2021 population estimates, and we do it for the county, state, and nation estimates. The approach takes data from the 2020 census, also the results of the vintage 2020 population estimates, and then the 2020 demographic analysis estimates. And we blend those all together into what we call our blended base. And we've talked about that at several of these webinars in the past. And so I won't go into too much detail, but I will talk about updates that we see specifically for this current vintage. So some impacts of the blended base. So the original iteration, which was vintage 2021, we saw that the blended base resulted in smoother age and sex distributions than the 2020 census counts. It also had a mitigating effect of the undercount of young children, particularly on the 0 to 4-year-olds who were undercounted in the 2020 census, and also on the 10 to 14-year-olds who were undercounted in the 2010 census. It was then carried forward through our estimates methodology. Subsequent versions of the blended base have captured geographic updates, have improved the way we process group quarters and population data, and have incorporated resident population by Hispanic origin from the 2020 census. So the blended base for vintage 2024. So one thing that's important to point out is that because of the scope and pace of our research in 2024, changes were not completed in time for the vintage 2024 base. So for the United States, the vintage 2024 base is basically the same as the vintage 2023 base. So the vintage 2024 base includes 2020 census data. So first of all, it has 2020 census data from our sub-county geographies, which are then aggregated up. They have noise, they have differential privacy noise added, and then we aggregate those up to create our state, county, and national totals. This is for the resident population, household population, and group quarters, and for group quarters, it's by facility type. We also include from 2020 census Hispanic or Latino Hispanic origin, and this is coming from the PL94 data. The blended base includes the 2020 demographic analysis estimates. So this is the national level population estimate by age and sex. And then it includes the vintage 2020 population estimates for April 1st, 2020. So this is the nation, state, and county population estimates by age, sex, and race. And then Hispanic origin was used to distribute the household and group quarters populations. In March 2022, the Census Bureau released the first results of undercounts and overcounts in the 2020 census. The results showed that some age groups and racial and ethnic groups were undercounted. At that time, many people looked to the Population Estimates Program, especially the blended base, to address these coverage issues. So in March of 2022, the Base Evaluation Research Team was formed. This team is made up of subject matter experts in the areas of population estimates, age and sex statistics, coverage measurement, race and ethnicity, demography, and disclosure avoidance. So findings from the BERT research inform decisions about what 2020 census data are used in the blended base. And BERT is working with experts from other census projects to maximize the impact of research efforts. Research has progressed in most of the areas. It has progressed most in the areas of age and sex, Hispanic origin, and also the post-enumeration survey. Sorry about that. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a summary of our updates to the methodology for vintage 2024. So for the base population, for the United States, we don't have any changes relative to vintage 2023. But for Puerto Rico, we now use group quarters population characteristics from the PL94 data. So this is coming from the 2020 census. For vital statistics, we began a phased transition to estimating births and deaths based exclusively on data from the National Center for Health Statistics at the subnational level, so for states and counties. Previously, we combined data provided by representatives of the Federal State Cooperative for Population Estimates, or FSCPE, with birth and death records from the National Center for Health Statistics. Our FSCPE data were used to adjust the geographic distribution of births and deaths within the state. So we are phasing that process out, and we started doing that for vintage 2024. The biggest changes to our methods for vintage 2024 are in how we estimate net international migration. In the past 3 years, there have been notable increases in international migration, especially among refugees, asylum seekers, and other types of humanitarian migrants. We use newly available and reliable monthly administrative data on these humanitarian migrant cases from the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program and the Office of Homeland Security Statistics to enhance the estimates of non-U.S. born immigration. So we applied an adjustment factor at the national level where we added 75% of the number of humanitarian migrants that were in our benchmark database to these ACS-based estimates of foreign-born immigration. This is a similar process. It's a similar method to what we did for vintage 2021 and vintage 2022 to make adjustments for COVID. And I'll talk about that more in a moment. So the adjustments for humanitarian migrants is incorporated into the national total only. And this coming year, we're going to do research on ways to improve how we can distribute that national estimate to states and counties, and how to improve the overall geographic characteristics of this estimate. So I mentioned that this is a similar process to what we did in earlier in the decade as we were addressing changes to our methods because of COVID. So this graph is very similar to something that was released in vintage 2022. It shows our benchmark database, which are the bars, and I'll talk more about it in a second. And then it also shows how that relates to our ACS-based estimates of migration flows. So again, the bars in this graph are from administrative data that are produced by other agencies, mostly the Department of Homeland Security. And the blue line, or the blue bar, sorry, is our immigrant visas. The orange bar are work visas. The gray bar are students. And then the teal are humanitarian migrants. The solid line is our ACS-based approach. So this would be the foreign-born population whose residence 1 year ago was abroad. We call this our ROIA population. So residence 1 year ago was abroad. And then the dashed line are the adjustments that we made because of COVID. So the first thing I want to point out is from 2010 to 2015, you notice that our ACS-based approach tracks very closely with the administrative data. However, once you get to about 2016, we see that it's not tracking quite as well. This is something that's carried through into COVID. So for 2020 to 2021, we held the 2019 one-year ACS data constant because of data quality issues with the 2020 ACS. You're probably aware that 2020, because of these data issues, we didn't release that as an official, estimates. 2020 ACS was actually kept back as experimental estimates. So this is something we normally do with our estimates. The ACS data are lagged, meaning that they're not current when we need to use them. They're at least 1 year old. For example, for 2024, for this vintage, the most recent ACS data that we have available to work with is the 2023 one-year ACS file. And so because of that lag, we have to make, we have to do something to make it more current. So our method has always held that last year of data constant. And you see here in the graph that we're holding 2019 constant until 2021. That's why it's so flat for all those years. We're just holding it steady. So this was during COVID, and the data we're using were pretty high because we're just holding it constant. But we knew that international migration had really dropped because there was a lot of concern about people moving across borders, people, spreading the virus. And so from our benchmarks, we knew that ACS level that we had wasn't accurate. So what we did is we used our benchmarks to adjust that number down. So we brought that 2019 ACS number down to meet the benchmarks. So that was going into COVID. Coming out of COVID, we kind of had the opposite issue. So for 2022, the administrative data were showing that the immigration had increased, but the lagged ACS data still showed that immigration was down. So we had to adjust the estimate upward in order to get it to match our benchmarks that we had. And so there's two important limitations to our method, how we use the ACS data, that are limitations for creating estimates. The first I've talked about quite a bit is that the data are lagged. They're at least a year old when we go to use them. And so that can that can make them less accurate. Another issue is that the ACS may not be fully, the foreign-born population may not be fully represented in the ACS. There have been studies that show that some foreign-born population groups are underrepresented or undercounted in the American Community Survey. And so if we're only using those data and not adjusting them, then our estimates might be low because of that. So this was the process we used during COVID-19. There's specific COVID-19 adjustments. And the vintage 2024 population estimates still include these adjustments, but we've added new adjustments for the last 2 years because of increased international migration that we're not picking up with our previous method. And we have a blog that'll come out on Thursday that'll have details about that. And so please look for that if you have more questions. All right, now I'm going to talk about the 2020 Modified Age and Race Census File. So we're planning to release the 2020 Census Modified Age and Race Census File, or MARC file, in early 2025. So the 2020 census included an option for people to identify as some other race, but the input data that we use to produce the population estimates do not have that category. And so each decade, we do this process where we take those some other race observations and we reallocate them into the other race categories. That way, our data that we use from the census can be consistent with the input data that we use to make the estimates. And so we need this file to use the 2020 census race data and the population estimates. So in addition to having modified race, this file is also going to have modified age. So it's going to include smooth age data for a subset of observations to address age heaping in the 2020 census. So for vintage 2025, we will use the 2020 MARC file to expand the amount of 2020 census data in the blended base. This slide shows different resources and contact information. For example, our coordination, dissemination, and outreach branch. If you have specific questions about the data files that are released later this week. It also has information about our base evaluation and research team. There's a email address there if you have questions. Our link to our population and housing unit estimates website. Also a link to a blog on age heaping in the 2020 census, and a blog on the BERT recommendations regarding the use of the 2020 post-enumeration survey and the vintage 2023 population estimates. So with that, we can take your questions. And again, we've asked you to put the questions in the chat, and Kevin Berrigan-Smith is going to join me to help kind of talk through, or he's going to ask the questions, I'm going to answer them. With that, Kevin, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, everybody. So we've gotten quite a bit of questions in the Q&A. First question I can go ahead and answer. It's, will the slides be made available? They will. All of the materials from today's webinar, including the recording, will be made available in about 2 to 3 weeks. Our next question, Eric, is when you were referencing the data product availability, when you were discussing cities and towns, did you mean county subdivisions?
Yeah, there are sub-county estimates, and these are the city and town geographic levels. Luke, Is that, I'm not sure what they mean by county subdivisions. Is that,
So
can you help me
we
out
yeah,
there?
we do county subdivisions, and we do, I mean, we do incorporated places, county subdivisions, and the primitive level of geography and the estimates universe, but county subdivisions are definitely part of what we release in our sub-county estimates.
We do
Okay, thanks,
use
Luke.
cities and towns kind of interchangeably with incorporated places and minor civil divisions.
Next question, discussing the API. So the question is asking if the vintage 2024 estimates will be made available on the API. I can go ahead and answer that question. So the Population Estimates Program continues to work closely with our Center for Enterprise Dissemination to make the estimates available on the API and data.census.gov. Right now, there's not a current timeline for the release on the API or data.census.gov, but we continue to update our stakeholders as progress is made. So in the meantime, please continue to access our PEP estimates on the Population and Housing Unit Estimates website. Next question. Next question. If I understand correctly, the method for injecting differential privacy noise remains consistent, but the actual values added, subtracted, change from vintage to vintage, making the 2020 base a moving target. Does this sound right?
Yes.
Yes.
But I would emphasize that based on the amount of noise that we are infusing, which is a very low level, we don't think of it as, a target that's moving very much. But yes, it does change because of the noise from vintage to vintage.
Thanks, Christine. Next question. Could someone say a little about the timing of the transition to the new race and ethnic categories, SPD 15, within the context of the population estimates?
Sure, I'll chime in on this one as well. Our transition is currently kind of a product of research in our area. So we are kind of waiting to see how it progresses. Under the best circumstances, we would be transitioning with our vintage 2025 estimates. Our plan would be to put out the estimates products both in the old categories and the new categories. And as we kind of move through the year, we'll be able to say kind of with more certainty whether we're on track for that. But that is our goal. And those estimates would be released in June of 2025, as you saw on the schedule slide earlier in the presentation.
Excellent. Next question. For subnational birth estimates, how are births in an adjacent state coded? In the population estimates, do those births get added to the state where the birth occurs or the state where the household resides?
This is a great question. So we do residents. This is a common. What the question is referring to is if, say, somebody's born in a hospital in Boston, but they're from New Hampshire. The way we would do it, since we use NCHS data from the National Center for Health Statistics, is we would record that birth as a birth from somebody in New Hampshire, because that's where they're a resident from. So we do residents, not occurrence.
Thanks, Luke. Next question asks, how much higher would the 2023 international migration figures been if the new method had been incorporated last year in vintage 2023?
So this is something we're going to release on Thursday. Each year when we make a new vintage of estimates, we recalculate the time series back to the census date. So it's from April 1st, 2020 up until July 1st, 2024. So there will be in that new vintage a new July 1st, 2023 estimate. And we're using this method change for both the 2023 period and 2024 period. But you can see that on Thursday when we release the data and the blog that describes it in more detail.
Thanks, Eric. Next question asks, if you are adding the new immigration adjustments only to the US total population, does that mean that the state populations will not add up to the national population total?
No, so we're making that adjustment at the national level. What I said earlier is that there's not a specific adjustment or change. There's not a change to how we are distributing the national estimate to states and counties. And when we say distributing it, we take that national total and then we have a method for kind of assigning it to states and counties. And so we're doing that for the full foreign-born immigration, non-US citizen, non-US born immigration population altogether, and not breaking out that new humanitarian migration separately. And so the increase at the national level would definitely be reflected in the totals for states and counties.
Next question. Will change in group quarters or GQ population be attributed to domestic migration, or will changes in GQ pop reflect in part international migration?
So when you look at the public releases for December at the state level, and then also in when you look at the March release for the counties, domestic migration includes GQ change. However, one thing you can do, and we released the blog last March when we did the March release for Vintage 2023, can actually re-release the GQ population as part of that release as well. So you can, in the March release, the annual GQ population is included in the all data file. And so you can actually see how much GQ change happens annually. You can calculate it yourself, and you can see how much of that is being factored into net domestic migration, all the way down to the county level. So that's something you can take a look at. That's on our website. That was a I believe America Counts story. We can put the link of it for in the chat for you.
Thanks, Luke. For the modified race age file, will Hispanic be a separate variable from race, or will it follow the new OMB guidelines and have it included with race? I'm particularly curious about people who reported some other race and selected Hispanic on the census.
Yeah, that's a great question. That file is going to reflect 2020 census data and the way those data were collected. And so it will have separate variables for race and for Hispanic origin.
Thanks, Eric. Next question. Can you elaborate on the 75% of humanitarian migrants? Why 75%? Are other border crossings accounted for?
Great question. So in our research on ways that we could improve the net international migration estimates, we looked a lot at the American Community Survey and the other benchmark data that we have available, and looked for populations that might not be fully represented. And so that adjustment factor was based on that research. We also worked closely with some of the top immigration demographers in the country to do some of that research. And so we feel confident that that was a good approach in order to make our estimates more current and reflect recent trends that we've seen in international migration that might not have been picked up in our ACS approach.
Thanks, Eric. Next question we have here asks, the Congressional Budget Office's estimates for net international migration are considerably higher than yours. Are there any plans to review their methodology and revise PEF's estimates of net international migration?
Great question. So as they were developing their methodology, they reached out to us. We've been talking with them closely, talking with people at the Department of Homeland Security. Estimating international migration flows is hard, and each agency has access to different data and different methods. And so, CBO has been developing their projection. We've talked with them quite a bit as we've been developing our estimates. We've talked with DHS and other groups. And so, as you'll see on Thursday, our estimates are we feel an improvement over what we've done in the past as far as making our estimate more current and being able to be representative of recent trends.
Thanks, Eric. Could you explain a little bit more about what age heaping is?
Yeah, so age heaping is this phenomenon that we see in census data. You can also see it in survey data, but it's where people report ages. They tend to report ages that are kind of convenient. They'll report ages that end in 5 and 0. So if I don't know the exact age of someone, I'm not likely to guess I'm more likely to guess 50 or 55 than to guess 53. And so that's age heaping. And what we see is in data that have age heaping, we see kind of these spikes on ages that end in 0 and 5. And so the 2020 census data, there's a lot of age heaping, a lot more than what we've seen in previous years. And just to be clear, there's always age heaping in census data, and not just in the US, but it's something you see in other countries as well. There's always age heaping, but for 2020 census, it was a lot more pronounced than what we've seen in 2000 or 2010. And so because age is such an important variable for us as we are doing the cohort component method, it's really important that we have good age data. And so what we're doing for the MARC file is that we're taking out a subset of the population. And these are people who only reported age on the census. They didn't have a date of birth that was reported, only age. And so we think that this is most likely where someone was I don't want to say guessing, but kind of guessing about what their age was. And so we're taking that subset out and smoothing their ages and then putting them back in. And so it really has a big impact on the overall age distributions. It really gets rid of the age heaping, and we have statistical measures that we use. Specifically, it's called the Whipple's Index to show the amount of heaping in a population. And so in comparing the statistics before we do this adjustment to afterwards, it's really making a big improvement to the data. So we're very excited about that aspect of the MARC file. And we think that especially for data users, that'll be really important, especially as they're trying to make estimates or do population projections, because again, those are so sensitive to age data and the quality of age data. And there's a blog, and I think we do have it on the slide, the second to last slide that I shared, but there's a link to a blog that Luke and I did about age heaping.
Thanks, Eric. The next question is asking, am I correct that the race ethnic categories in the birth certificate data used for the 2030 DA estimates are unlikely to be consistent with the race ethnic categories used in the census? Won't that make it impossible to make DA estimates to assess the quality of the census?
So we haven't produced 2030 demographic analysis estimates yet. But there's always this issue with DA that the characteristics and especially the historical birth records, might be inconsistent with the current censuses that we're looking at. And so in the past, we've used bridging factors and other techniques to address this. This is something we'll probably we will have to do for 2030. Demographic analysis is to use bridging factors, and those are actually being produced by the U.S. Census Bureau by colleagues in the population division to have bridging factors that can go from the race classifications with separate question to race classification with a combined question. I don't know if Luke or Christine want to also jump in on this about just the bridging and the need for consistent race data.
I mean, I think you covered it. We've got time before 2030 DA to work out a technique, but as Eric mentioned, this has been a challenge historically, so I'm pretty confident we'll figure something out.
Next question asks, since estimates for international migration for 2023 and 2024 are both based on the 2023 ACS, will the 2023 and 2024 estimates be about the same?
So the estimates will be, the ACS portion of the estimate will come from the 2023 ACS. And that's just because we don't have 2024 available yet. But that adjustment that we make using the administrative data, that will be specific for 2024. And that's because we have data that have been released by the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies that reflect trends that happened in 2024 up until July 1st. Remember, our estimates are made as of, up until July 1st. And so we do have data that's current year that we can use there. So it's really, that's another really cool aspect of this method change, is it allows us to, in the current estimate year, to be, not just hold it constant anymore, but to be, again, reflective of current trends.
Thanks, Eric. Is there a reason the humanitarian immigration won't be distributed down to the state or county level? Is it a data limitation?
It was really a timing and resource constraint issue that we didn't have a clear method for how to do that this vintage, and it's something we need to do more research and have a strong method to implement that. And so with all of our changes that we do in the estimates, there's a lot of research that goes into it, a lot of testing, and so we just didn't have time to do that this vintage, and so given constraints. And so really our goal was to have a strong national level estimate, and then our plan for this coming vintage is to develop a method that we can implement, that we can distribute that down to states and counties.
Just to be clear too, and probably most people understand this, but even though we applied it at the national level, there is still an impact at the state and county level. It's just not, finessed to be specific across the geographies. It's just, an across the board increase. But you will see the impact of it at the lower levels of geography.
Yeah, thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Eric. Going down through the rest of the questions, I believe we answered all of them on international migration. There was a question asking for the link to the methodology page that Eric referenced. I think that may have been sent in the chat, if someone can confirm.
Do you want one of us to confirm, or who's confirming?
Hi, Kevin. No, I don't think it's been shared yet, but we will share it.
Great. Thank you so much. A question has come in asking about what roughly is the magnitude of the 75% adjustment at the national level?
You'll see on Thursday.
So
Yeah,
stay tuned.
We just can't share that at this time. It's pre-release, and so on Thursday you'll see it's detailed very carefully in the blog that'll be coming out that day, and just in the estimates tables and everything. So you'll see it.
Thanks, Eric. If the modified age race census file is slated for early 2025, how about the intercensal estimates?
I think if the MARC file gets out in early 2025, that we would probably be on track for maybe a late summer, fall release of the rest of the intercensals.
Thanks, Christine. Is there any possibility of releasing age, sex, race, Hispanic products for city places that meet a minimum population threshold, just like the ACS 1 year does? Why not generate those numbers for cities with at least 20,000 or 65,000?
That's a great question. I mean, it's a combination of factors. I would say partly there's a source data / methodology component where the quality of the data available below the county level for our methodology are not necessarily as strong as they are at higher levels of geography. We also have a resource limitation, where if we were going to expand the program that way, we would need more staff to put out, the additional data products. But I mean, it's not something that would be impossible. It's just not necessarily on our list of priorities at this time, given the specific methods and products that we are responsible for. I don't know if Luke or Eric wants to add to that at all.
I mean, I think that's the gist of it. I mean, if you think about our method, currently our sub county method isn't even geared just to do characteristics. The characteristics for our counties are derived from a lot of administrative records that we don't, in some cases, even get sub-county detail for. So it would be a pretty big research project for us, but it would be great if we could get that kind of detail. If ever there were a day we had enough resources to do that kind of research, it definitely would be one that would be on the list, I think.
And I will add, staff in the population estimates program, we are working with people in other parts of the census, specifically in the research and methodology directorate, on ways to like some kind of experimental estimates on ways to push our county level estimates down to like lower levels of geography. And that's more focused on like census tracts. Specifically, that's called the continuous count study, but we are involved in that and looking for, new kind of methodologies with them, but it isn't something that would be like we would be releasing anytime soon. It's still in the like research phase, very much so. But kind of exciting to think about, so we are, like, we hear you that that's something that would be, there's an interest or demand for that, so.
We received another question about the availability of slides. Yes, the slides and the recording will be available in approximately 2 to 3 weeks on the Census Academy website, so stay tuned. Another question on international migration. So you'll be using the proxy universe method to distribute the national immigration adjustment. Is that right?
Yes. And just for more detail on that, the proxy universe method is where we take distributions from the American Community Survey and we use that to distribute our national total. We do that by proportions. And so if you think about it, for our estimates, we have to produce, county estimates by age, sex, race, Hispanic origin for all of our components. And so that's a big difference between what we do at Census Bureau and the Pop Estimates program and what people at other federal agencies do. We have to not only make that national total, we have to make it down, by full characteristics to counties. And so it is a pretty challenging process. And again, our goal for next vintage is to try to improve how we're doing that, creating the state and county estimates, for international migration.
Thanks, Eric. We have a question related to the international database, a product that's not produced by the Population Estimates program, but by our colleagues in the Population Division. But maybe someone knows a little something. So the question is, for the US dependent areas and freely associated states, the recent International Database, or IDB, updates did not include any updates for these areas. Do you know when the data for these areas will be updated in the IDB?
I would say email the pop.cdob@census.gov email address. And we can reach out to the international database folks to get you an answer for that one. That's definitely kind of question to reach out to us so we can try to get you connected to the right people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Luke. Another question. Can we expect a new method of distributing the 2024 humanitarian immigration subnationally for the 2025 vintage? In other words, could states potentially see large revision to international migration in vintage 2025?
They could. As Christine mentioned earlier, our method that we're implementing for vintage 2024 doesn't do any specific distribution for those humanitarian migrants. And so just all non-US born immigration will change in a similar way. And so as we're trying to refine that method and improve that method for Vintage 2025, you could see a change to like states and to counties relative to what you'll see in Vintage 2024.
Thanks, Eric. A question related to the release this week. Will there be an embargoed release this week associated with the total population estimates for Vintage 2024?
No,
No.
not for the December release. The December release usually is one of those ones where we don't have an embargo just because the amount of time we have between getting our input data for production of creating the estimates is really tight between that and when we were supposed to get the data out the door in December. So there, every day counts. But future releases will, some of them do actually have embargoes. So it's a good question.
Yes, and I'll just add, we do embargo the March, May, and June releases.
Thanks, Yesenia. And that is all the questions in the Q&A. Pass it back to you, Anthony.
All right, I don't know if any of the speakers have any concluding remarks.
Just thank you very much, everybody, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So that concludes today's webinar. Everyone have a good rest of the afternoon, and you may disconnect at this time.